The old pickup truck kicked up dust as it rumbled down the dirt road. Its red paint faded from years under the Georgia sun. In the passenger seat, Anna clutched her leather-bound journal, watching the pine trees blur past her window. Her daddy's words from breakfast still rang in her ears. "We've got a big rally coming up this weekend, baby girl. Need you to help your mama with the uniforms." The familiar knot formed in her stomach. At 22, she'd spent her whole life in this small town, where Confederate flags hung from porches like Christmas decorations, and certain folks knew to be out of sight by sundown. That's what her daddy always said, and as the local leader of their organization, his word was law. The library where she worked was her only escape. Between the worn pages of books, she found worlds bigger than her daddy's narrow view. The building itself was nothing special, just a single-storied brick structure with cracked steps and windows that needed washing. But to Anna, it was freedom. "Morning, Mrs. Parker," she called out to the elderly librarian as she walked in, the air conditioning hitting her like a blessing in the summer heat. The old clock on the wall showed 9:15 a.m., another day of sorting returns and helping high school kids with their research papers. She was halfway through shelving medical journals when she heard an unfamiliar voice at the front desk. Deep, warm, educated, not the usual local drawl. Her curiosity pulled her around the shelf, and she froze. The man speaking with Mrs. Parker stood tall in pressed khakis and a light blue button-down, his dark skin contrasting with the brightest smile she'd ever seen. He held himself with quiet confidence, gesturing as he talked about needing research materials for a new clinic he was opening in town. Anna ducked back behind the shelf, her heart racing. Everything she'd been taught her whole life screamed at her to keep her distance, to call her daddy, to protect their way of life. But something else, something buried deep beneath years of Sunday sermons and rally speeches, made her want to know more. "Anna, honey." Mrs. Parker's voice carried through the stacks. "Could you help Dr. Thomas find these medical journals he's looking for?" Her hands trembled as she smoothed her sundress. "Coming, Mrs. Parker." She watched her feet take one step, then another, fighting every ingrained instinct telling her to run the other way. The doctor's handshake was firm but gentle. Professional. Nothing like the warnings she'd heard all her life. "Thank you for your help," he said, handing her a list of journal titles. "I'm opening a clinic on Oak Street, focusing on families who can't afford regular medical care." As Anna led him through the stacks, she found herself stealing glances. His movements were precise, methodical as he examined each journal. He spoke about his plans for the clinic with such passion that she momentarily forgot everything else: who she was, who her daddy was, what people would say. "You really think you can make a difference?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. He looked up from the journal in his hands, and their eyes met. There was no judgment there, no hatred, just understanding and something that looked a lot like hope. "I have to try," he said simply. "Everyone deserves care, don't you think?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Anna felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock she didn't know existed. Standing there in the quiet of the library, surrounded by books filled with knowledge that didn't care about skin color, she realized her world would never be the same. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of call numbers and quiet conversation. With each book she helped him find, another brick in her wall of prejudice began to crumble. She learned he'd grown up just 30 miles away, earned his medical degree up north, and chosen to come back home to help his community. When he finally gathered his materials to leave, he paused at the desk. "I'll need to do more research as we set up the clinic. I hope you'll be here to help." Anna nodded, not trusting her voice. As she watched him walk out into the bright southern sun, she knew she was standing at a crossroads. Behind her lay everything familiar: her family, her community, her entire way of thinking. Ahead lay unknown territory, as frightening as it was appealing. That night, lying in her childhood bed, she stared at the ceiling fan spinning lazy circles above her. Her daddy's words about the upcoming rally echoed in her head, but for the first time, they sounded hollow. Something new had taken root in her heart, and she knew with terrifying certainty that it would grow, whether she wanted it to or not. 2 weeks passed, and the library became more than just Anna's workplace. It turned into a sanctuary. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Dr. Thomas would visit, his arms full of medical journals and community health papers. Their conversation started small, just whispers between the shelves about book recommendations and local weather, but slowly grew into something more meaningful. "Have you read this one?" he asked one quiet afternoon, holding up a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The late summer sun streamed through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. "It's what made me want to come back home and make a difference." Anna nodded, remembering how she'd secretly read it under her covers with a flashlight, hiding it from her daddy who'd banned such books from their house. "It changed how I see things too," she admitted softly, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. That day, they talked for hours in the back corner of the library, their voices low but animated. He told her about his dreams for the clinic, not just treating illnesses, but teaching prevention, nutrition, and healthy living to everyone in town, regardless of their background or ability to pay. His eyes lit up when he spoke about helping people, and Anna found herself drawn to his passion like a moth to flame. "Why don't you come see the clinic?" he suggested as closing time approached. "We're still setting up, but I'd love to show you what we're doing." Anna's heart skipped a beat. Meeting at the library was one thing. It was public, safe, explainable. But visiting his clinic, that was different. That was deliberate. That was dangerous. Yet the next day, she found herself parking her daddy's old truck 3 blocks away from Oak Street, her palms sweaty on the steering wheel. She told her mama she was going to the grocery store, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. The clinic was smaller than she'd imagined, just a modest building with fresh paint and new signs in the windows. But inside, it was alive with possibility. Volunteers moved about, carrying boxes of supplies and arranging furniture. To her surprise, she saw faces of all colors working together, laughing, sharing stories. Dr. Thomas greeted her with that same warm smile that had first caught her attention. "Welcome to our little dream," he said, leading her through rooms that would soon help heal their community's wounds, both physical and otherwise. As they walked, Anna noticed something she'd never seen before: hope. It filled every corner, every interaction, every plan for the future. These people weren't just opening a medical clinic, they were trying to stitch together a torn community. "Would you like to help?" he asked, holding out a box of children's books for the waiting room. "We could use someone with your knowledge of literature to set up a reading corner for the kids." Their fingers brushed as she took the box, and neither pulled away immediately. The touch was electric, forbidden, and terrifying in its simplicity. In that moment, Anna realized she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Later that evening, as she drove home, with the setting sun painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, her daddy's truck radio crackled with news about local protests against the new clinic. Her stomach churned as she recognized the hate in those voices, voices that had once seemed so right and familiar. At dinner, her daddy couldn't stop talking about the troublemakers trying to change their town. "Ain't right," he growled, stabbing at his meatloaf. "Folks need to remember their place." Anna pushed her peas around her plate, the food tasteless in her mouth. Every word her daddy spoke felt like a knife twisting in her gut. Because now she knew Dr. Thomas. She'd seen his kindness, his intelligence, his genuine desire to help everyone, even those who hated him. That night, she lay awake long after the crickets started their evening song, thinking about choices and consequences. Her whole life, she'd been taught that some lines couldn't be crossed, some differences couldn't be bridged. But in just 2 weeks, those ironclad beliefs had started to rust and crumble. She touched her fingers where they had brushed against his, remembering the warmth, the connection, the possibility. Outside her window, The moon cast soft shadows through the oak trees, and for the first time in her life, Anna understood what it meant to stand at the edge of everything you've ever known, look into the unknown, and want to jump. The late summer heat pressed down on the small town like a heavy blanket as Anna walked into the library that morning. Her steps were lighter these days, her heart beating a different rhythm. The familiar smell of old books and dust motes dancing in the sunlight welcomed her, but today felt different. Everything felt different. She'd been volunteering at the clinic twice a week now, always careful to park far away and take different routes home. The reading corner she'd set up was becoming popular with the local kids, who didn't seem to care about the color of the hands that held their books during story time. That morning, as she sorted through returned books, Mrs. Parker approached her desk with knowing eyes. "You've changed, child," the old librarian said softly, adjusting her reading glasses. "There's a light in you that wasn't there before." Anna felt her cheeks warm, wondering if her secret was as visible as the morning sun. Around noon, Dr. Thomas came in, but something was wrong. His usual easy smile was replaced with a tight expression that made Anna's heart sink. "Someone vandalized the clinic last night," he said quietly, running his hand over his face. "Broke windows, spray-painted messages, the usual ignorance." Anna's fingers gripped the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. She just knew, that some of her daddy's friends were behind this. Probably encouraged by his words at their latest meeting, where he'd ranted about outside agitators trying to change their way of life. "Let me help clean up," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "After my shift." His eyes met hers, filled with something that made her breath catch. "It's not safe for you," he said. "If anyone saw you there." "I don't care anymore," she replied, surprising herself with her own conviction. The words hung between them like a declaration of independence. That afternoon, Anna helped scrub hate off walls, while volunteers replaced broken windows. As the sun began to set, painting the clinic walls in shades of gold, she and Dr. Thomas found themselves alone in the reading corner she created. "Why do you stay?" she asked, straightening a row of children's books. "You could practice anywhere, somewhere safer." He was quiet for a moment, picking up a copy of The Little Prince that had fallen to the floor. "Because change has to start somewhere," he finally said. "And it starts with people brave enough to see past what they've been taught to believe." Their eyes met, and Anna felt the world shift beneath her feet. All the invisible lines that had been drawn in their small town, all the barriers and boundaries she'd been raised never to cross, they suddenly seemed as flimsy as spider webs in the wind. But reality came crashing back when her phone buzzed. A text from her mama. "Where are you?" "Daddy's asking." The familiar fear crept back into her bones, but now it was mixed with something else, determination. "I have to go," she said, grabbing her bag. But before she could turn away, Dr. Thomas caught her hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for helping, for seeing." The touch of his hand sent warmth spreading through her chest, rising up her neck to her cheeks. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. Everything she'd been taught, every sermon, every rally, every family dinner conversation screamed against it. But her heart had stopped listening to those voices. Driving home in the gathering dusk, Anna realized she was living in two worlds now. One was the world she'd grown up in, with its rigid rules and harsh judgments. The other was the world she discovered at the clinic and in quiet conversations between library shelves. A world where people were just people, where kindness mattered more than color. That night at dinner, her daddy talked about organizing a protest against the clinic. "Can't let them get comfortable here," he said, his voice hard with hatred. "Got to show them they're not welcome." Anna pushed her food around her plate, her appetite gone. Every bite tasted like ashes. For the first time, she heard her daddy's words for what they really were. Not protection of their way of life, but fear of change, fear of different, fear of love. In her room later, she pulled out her journal and wrote what she couldn't say aloud. I'm falling in love with everything I was taught to hate. The words stared back at her from the page, terrifying and liberating all at once. There was no going back now. The question was, where would this road lead? The small diner just outside of town became their secret place. With its neon sign flickering against the darkening sky and truckers passing through who didn't know or care about local politics, it felt like a different world. Anna sat across from Dr. Thomas in a worn vinyl booth, watching steam rise from her coffee cup while country music played softly in the background. My mama used to say that coffee's too bitter for young ladies, she said with a small laugh, taking a deliberate sip. Small rebellions, she was learning, could taste sweet. He smiled, stirring sugar into his own cup. And what else did your mama say young ladies shouldn't do? Just about everything I'm doing right now, she replied, and they both knew she wasn't just talking about the coffee. Their meetings had started innocently enough, discussions about the clinic's reading program over quick lunches. But soon they found themselves lingering longer, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his dreams of expanding the clinic, of building bridges in their divided town. She shared stories about growing up, carefully avoiding mentions of her daddy's activities. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes and graying hair, kept their cups filled without asking questions. Maybe she saw something in them that reminded her of her own youth, or maybe she just understood that some stories need space to unfold. The kids loved story time today, Anna said, thinking about the afternoon at the clinic. She'd read The Sneetches by Dr. Seuss, watching little faces, both black and white, light up with understanding. One little girl asked why grown-ups can't learn from children's books. Out of the mouths of babes, he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. His hand rested on the table, inches from hers. So close, so far. A truck rumbled past outside, its headlights sweeping across their faces for a moment. In that flash of light, their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Anna felt her heart skip, then raced to catch up. We're playing with fire, she whispered, but she didn't move her hand away when his fingers brushed against hers. I know, he said simply. The touch was gentle, tentative, like a question neither of them dared to ask out loud. The jukebox switched to an old love song, one her parents used to dance to in the kitchen when she was little. The irony wasn't lost on her. How many times had she watched them sway to this same melody, her daddy singing along, before he headed out to those nighttime meetings where they planned how to keep people like Dr. Thomas in their place. Tell me about your favorite book, she said suddenly, needing to break the tension that had built between them. He launched into an animated description of a novel about courage and change, his passion for stories matching her own. Their fingers remained intertwined on the table, hidden by the shadow of the napkin dispenser. Such a small thing, holding hands in a diner. But in their town, at that moment, it felt like an act of revolution. Time slipped away like sand through an hourglass. The dinner crowd thinned out, leaving them in their quiet bubble of conversation and cautious touches. It wasn't until the waitress started stacking chairs that they realized how late it had gotten. I should get home, Anna said reluctantly, thinking of the excuses she'd have to make. She'd told her parents she was at a church youth group meeting. Another lie in a growing collection. In the parking lot, hidden between his car and hers, they stood close enough to share breath. The night air was thick with humidity and unspoken words. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch sending shivers down her spine. This is dangerous, he murmured, but he didn't step away. Everything worth having is, she replied, surprised by her own boldness. The kiss, when it came, was soft and sweet and terrifying in its rightness. It lasted only seconds, but Anna knew it would echo in her heart forever. This wasn't just about breaking rules anymore. This was about breaking free. Driving home that night, her lips still tingling, Anna watched the moon hang low and full over the Georgia pines. She thought about choices and consequences, about love and fear, about the fine line between bravery and foolishness. The world she'd grown up in was crumbling around her, but from its ruins, something beautiful was trying to grow. The storm broke on a Tuesday afternoon. Anna was restocking the children's section at the library when she heard the heavy footsteps. She knew those boots, knew that walk, had heard it coming up the porch steps every evening of her life. Her daddy's face was red with rage as he stormed through the library doors, clutching photographs in his trembling hand. "What is this?" he hissed, throwing the pictures onto her desk. There they were, captured in grainy detail, her and Dr. Thomas at the diner, holding hands across the table. Another showed them in the parking lot, caught in that one precious moment of their first kiss. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Mrs. Parker stood frozen at her desk, her hand over her mouth. The few patrons present quickly gathered their things and hurried out, sensing the coming storm. "Someone's been following you." Her daddy's voice shook with barely contained fury. "Been watching you betray everything we stand for. Everything I taught you." Anna's hands trembled, but she forced herself to stand straight. 22 years of fear and obedience warred with something newer, stronger, love, dignity, and the certainty that she was finally doing something right. "I'm not betraying anything," she said quietly. "I'm just loving someone." The slap echoed through the library like a gunshot. Mrs. Parker gasped. Anna's cheek burned, but she didn't flinch. She touched her face gently, looking at her daddy with new eyes. In that moment, she saw him clearly, not as the strong, protective father of her childhood, but as a man consumed by hate. "You're no daughter of mine," he spat. "Pack your things and be gone before I get home tonight." He turned and stormed out, leaving behind the scattered photographs and the heavy silence. Mrs. Parker rushed over, tissues in hand, but Anna barely felt the sting anymore. A strange calm had settled over her, like the eye of a hurricane. She called Dr. Thomas from the library phone, her voice steady despite everything. "They know," was all she needed to say. "Stay there," he replied. "I'm coming." The next few hours passed in a blur. Mrs. Parker held her box up her desk while they waited, sharing stories of her own youth in the 60s, of choices made and lines crossed for love. Sometimes, the old librarian said, squeezing Anna's hand, "Doing the right thing costs everything. But not doing it costs even more." When Dr. Thomas arrived, his face was grim. "They're organizing at the clinic," he said. "Your father's people. It's not safe for you to go home." Anna thought of her childhood bedroom, her books, her mama's quilts. Everything she'd have to leave behind. "I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered. "Yes, you do," he said firmly, taking her hand. "My sister has a place in the next town over. You'll be safe there." As they loaded her few boxes into his car, Anna saw familiar trucks driving past, slowing down to watch. Word was spreading. Her daddy's influence ran deep in this town, and she knew that by morning, she'd be cut off from everything and everyone she'd ever known. Mrs. Parker hugged her tight before they left. "Your job will be here when things settle," she promised, pressing a small envelope into Anna's hand. "There's enough cash in there for a few weeks. Don't argue, just take it." The drive to the next town was silent, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Halfway there, at a red light, Anna finally broke down. The sobs came from deep inside, years of suppressed truth and pain pouring out. Dr. Thomas held her hand across the console, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her skin. "I lost everything," she cried. "No," he said softly. "You found yourself." As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Anna watched her hometown disappear in the rearview mirror. She thought about the photographs her daddy had thrown down, evidence of love he saw as betrayal. She thought about Mrs. Parker's words, about costs and choices. Her cheek still stung, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She was leaving behind a life built on hate, stepping into an unknown future. But for the first time, she was moving towards something, not running away. Love, she was learning, could be an act of rebellion. And sometimes, rebellion was the only way to be free. The doctor's sister's apartment was small but warm, filled with colorful artwork and the smell of home-cooked meals. Anna spent her first few days there in a daze, sleeping on the pull-out couch and trying to process everything that had happened. His sister, a high school art teacher, gave her space to grieve while making sure she ate and took care of herself. Family isn't always blood, she told Anna one evening over steaming cups of tea. Sometimes it's the people who catch you when you fall. News from their hometown trickled in through phone calls and text messages. The clinic had been surrounded by protesters, but local police, some of whom had been treated there for free, kept the peace. Mrs. Parker called daily, updating Anna about the library and slipping in mentions of her mama, who she said looked tired and worried. "Your mama came to the library today," Mrs. Parker said during one call. "She left something for you." Later that afternoon, a package arrived containing Anna's favorite childhood quilt and a note that simply read, "I love you. Be safe." The doctor split his time between the clinic and visiting Anna, making the hour-long drive whenever he could. They spent evenings talking about their future, about healing and hope, about building something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. "We could leave," he suggested one night as they sat on the apartment's tiny balcony, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "Start fresh somewhere else." But Anna shook her head. Running away won't change anything back home. Those kids at the clinic still need their stories. Those people still need healing, maybe now more than ever. 2 weeks after her exile, Anna found a job at the local library. It wasn't the same as her old position, but the familiar smell of books and the rhythm of shelving helped ground her. She started writing too, pouring her story onto pages late at night when sleep wouldn't come. The doctor's sister caught her one night, hunched over a notebook at the kitchen table. "You should share this," she said after reading a few pages. "There are others out there who need to know they're not alone." Then came the phone call that changed everything again. It was late, past midnight, and the doctor's voice was tight with urgency. "There's been a fire at the clinic," he said. "Everyone's okay, but it's bad." Anna insisted on going back with him. As they drove through the pre-dawn darkness, she thought about fear and fire, about how some people try to burn away what they don't understand. But she also thought about phoenixes rising from ashes. The clinic's walls were scorched black, windows broken, medical supplies destroyed. But something unexpected had happened during the fire. People from both sides of town had shown up to help fight the flames. Black and white hands passing buckets of water, working together to save what they could. As the sun rose over the damaged building, more people began to arrive. Church ladies with casseroles, teenagers with work gloves, old men with toolboxes. Anna's heart caught in her throat when she saw her mama among them, carrying cleaning supplies. Their eyes met across the parking lot. For a moment, neither moved. Then her mama rushed forward, wrapping her in a fierce hug that smelled like home and childhood and forgiveness. "I'm sorry," her mama whispered, holding her tight. "I'm so sorry I didn't stand up sooner." Throughout the day, more people came. Some were former patients, some were curious onlookers, and some were faces Anna recognized from her daddy's meetings. People who'd started questioning their own beliefs. "Love is stronger than hate," the doctor said as they watched the community come together. "It just takes longer sometimes." Standing in the rubble of what hate had tried to destroy, Anna saw something beautiful emerging. It wasn't just about her and the doctor anymore. Their story had become a spark, igniting conversations that had been avoided for generations. An old man who'd lived in the town his whole life summed it up best as he helped clear debris. Sometimes it takes watching something burn to see what really matters. That evening, as the sun set behind the damaged clinic, people from both sides of town shared meals and stories in the parking lot. Children played together while their parents talked quietly about rebuilding, not just the clinic, but their community. Anna watched it all, her hand intertwined with the doctor's, and realized that sometimes love doesn't just change two people, it can change the world around them, one heart at a time. The rebuilding of the clinic became a symbol of change in their small town. Every weekend, more people showed up with tools, supplies, and willing hands. Even those who had once protested against it now came with lumber and paint, their hearts softened by the sight of a community coming together. Anna's mama became a regular presence, bringing homemade lemonade and organizing other church ladies to help. She'd moved out of the family home, leaving Anna's daddy to stew in his anger alone. Some things are worth losing everything for, she told Anna one afternoon as they painted new walls together. But the peace wasn't meant to last. It happened during a Saturday volunteer day. The parking lot was full of cars, and the sound of hammers and friendly chatter filled the air. Anna was organizing medical supplies in the newly rebuilt storage room when she heard the commotion outside. Her daddy's truck had pulled up, kicking up dust in its wake. He wasn't alone. Several of his followers from the organization were with him, their faces hard with purpose. Anna's heart stopped when she saw the baseball bats in their hands. The doctor was outside, talking with an elderly patient. He turned at the sound of the truck, his body tensing as Anna's daddy stepped out. "This ends today," her daddy's voice boomed across the lot. "We've watched this poison spread through our town long enough." Anna ran outside, her feet carrying her before her mind could catch up. She placed herself between her daddy and the doctor, aware of the gathering crowd behind her. Her mama's voice called out in warning. "Daddy, stop." Anna's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "Look around you. Look at what's happening here." "Get out of the way, girl," he growled, but she saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as he took in the scene. Children of all colors had been playing together near the building. Their parents now stood protectively near them, phones out, recording everything. "Remember when I was little?" Anna continued, taking a step toward him. "You used to tell me that a daddy's job was to protect his baby girl from monsters. But Daddy, the only monsters here are the ones in our minds. The ones that tell us to hate people just because they're different." Her daddy's hands tightened on his bat. Behind him, some of his followers shuffled uncomfortably, looking at the phones recording them, at the children watching with wide eyes. "This man," Anna gestured to the doctor, "he treats everyone. Remember last month when Uncle Bobby had his heart attack? The ambulance was too far away, but this clinic saved his life. Did it matter then what color the hands were that helped him?" She saw the memory flash across her daddy's face. His brother being rushed to the clinic late one night, the doctor working tirelessly to stabilize him until the ambulance arrived. And these people, she swept her arm to include everyone gathered around. They're not destroyers. They're builders. They're healing our town, bringing us together. The only destruction happening here is from hate. A little girl broke away from her mother then, running up to Anna's daddy with the fearless innocence of childhood. She held up a crayon drawing, the clinic with stick figures of all colors holding hands around it. "This is my picture from story time," she announced proudly. "That's you." She pointed to one of the figures. "You can hold hands with us too." The bat slipped from her daddy's fingers, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. He stared at the picture, then at the child, then at the faces watching him. Faces of people he'd known his whole life, people whose children had played with Anna, people who'd sat next to him in church. His voice cracked. He looked at Anna, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in months. "What happened to us?" "Love happened, Daddy," she said softly. "Love happened." The other men started backing away, returning to their trucks. They could feel the shift in the air, the turning of a tide. Anna's daddy stood alone now, the little girl still holding up her drawing expectantly. With trembling fingers, he took the picture. A tear rolled down his weathered cheek as decades of hatred began to crack and crumble. like ice breaking up in spring. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. The doctor stepped forward then, standing beside Anna. "You start by putting down the bat," he said quietly, "and picking up a hammer instead. We've got some walls that still need building." That evening, as the sun set over their small town, Anna watched her daddy painting alongside the doctor, their shadows long against the newly raised walls. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't finished, but it was a beginning. Sometimes, she realized, the hardest walls to tear down are the ones inside our hearts. Months passed, and the seasons changed. The clinic flourished, growing from a small medical center into a true community hub. Anna's daddy started coming around more often, first just to help with repairs, then staying for community dinners. Each visit, the stiffness in his shoulders eased a little more, the lines around his eyes softening from anger to something like peace. One crisp autumn evening, he asked to speak with the doctor privately. Anna watched through the clinic window as the two men walked in the garden she'd helped plant. Their conversation lasted over an hour, and though she couldn't hear the words, she saw her daddy wipe his eyes more than once. He apologized, the doctor told her later that night as they closed up the clinic. Said he's been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of praying. Asked if he could volunteer here sometimes. The news spread through town like wildfire. The former leader of their local hate group now spent his Saturdays helping at the clinic he'd once tried to destroy. Some of his old followers were angry, feeling betrayed. But others, seeing his change, began their own journeys toward understanding. Anna's mama moved back home after her daddy publicly renounced his old beliefs and stepped down from his position in the organization. It wasn't easy. Decades of hatred don't disappear overnight. There were still arguments, still moments when old prejudices surfaced. But now, instead of letting them fester, they talked about them. The library welcomed Anna back too. She split her time between there and the clinic, organizing health literacy programs and running story times where children of all backgrounds sat together, learning that differences could be beautiful. One day, while sorting through old photographs for a community history project, Anna found the pictures her daddy had thrown at her that day in the library. Her and the doctor at the diner, their first kiss. She'd thought they were lost forever. "Keep them," Mrs. Parker said with a knowing smile. "I saved them for you. Someday, they'll be part of a bigger story." That bigger story was already unfolding. Other towns started sending people to learn from their example. News crews came to document how a small southern community was confronting its past and choosing a different future. Anna's daddy, to everyone's surprise, agreed to be interviewed. "I was wrong," he said simply to the cameras. "Love proved stronger than hate. My daughter taught me that." The doctor proposed on a quiet Sunday evening in the clinic garden. They were planting fall flowers, his hands covered in soil when he pulled out a simple ring. "This garden started from nothing," he said, "just like us. But look how it's grown." Their wedding plans caused quite a stir. Some people still couldn't accept the idea of their union. Anonymous letters arrived, filled with threats and ugly words. But for every hate-filled message, 10 more came offering support and love. Anna's mama threw herself into the wedding preparations with joy, while her daddy quietly asked if he could walk her down the aisle. "If you'll have me," he added, his voice rough with emotion. The little girl who'd shown him her drawing that pivotal day asked to be the flower girl. Her crayon picture, now framed, hung in the clinic waiting room as a reminder of how innocence and love could change hearts. One evening, as they sat on the clinic's porch watching the sunset, the doctor shared his own news. "The medical board approved our expansion plans," he said, squeezing Anna's hand. "We can start offering training programs, teaching other communities how to build bridges like we did." Anna looked out over their town, at the clinic that had become a symbol of healing, at the garden where flowers bloomed without caring about who planted them, at the people walking by who now smiled and waved instead of turning away. "You know what's funny?" she said softly. "Daddy always said he was protecting our way of life. He never realized that sometimes changing your way of life is the only way to save it. The doctor smiled, pulling her close as the last rays of sun painted the sky in shades of hope. Change isn't easy, he said, but love makes it worth it. Their story was far from over, but every day brought new chances to show their community and the world that love could build stronger bridges than hate ever could tear down. Months passed, and the seasons changed. The clinic flourished, growing from a small medical center into a true community hub. Anna's daddy started coming around more often, first just to help with repairs, then staying for community dinners. Each visit, the stiffness in his shoulders eased a little more, the lines around his eyes softening from anger to something like peace. One crisp autumn evening, he asked to speak with the doctor privately. Anna watched through the clinic window as the two men walked in the garden she'd helped plant. Their conversation lasted over an hour, and though she couldn't hear the words, she saw her daddy wipe his eyes more than once. He apologized, the doctor told her later that night as they closed up the clinic. Said he's been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of praying. Asked if he could volunteer here sometimes. The news spread through town like wildfire. The former leader of their local hate group now spent his Saturdays helping at the clinic he'd once tried to destroy. Some of his old followers were angry, feeling betrayed. But others, seeing his change, began their own journeys toward understanding. Anna's mama moved back home after her daddy publicly renounced his old beliefs and stepped down from his position in the organization. It wasn't easy. Decades of hatred don't disappear overnight. There were still arguments, still moments when old prejudices surfaced. But now, instead of letting them fester, they talked about them. The library welcomed Anna back too. She split her time between there and the clinic, organizing health literacy programs and running story times where children of all backgrounds sat together, learning that differences could be beautiful. One day, while sorting through old photographs for a community history project, Anna found the pictures her daddy had thrown at her that day in the library. Her and the doctor at the diner, their first kiss. She'd thought they were lost forever. Keep them, Mrs. Parker said with a knowing smile. I saved them for you. Someday, they'll be part of a bigger story. That bigger story was already unfolding. Other towns started sending people to learn from their example. News crews came to document how a small southern community was confronting its past and choosing a different future. Anna's daddy, to everyone's surprise, agreed to be interviewed. I was wrong, he said simply to the cameras. Love proved stronger than hate. My daughter taught me that. The doctor proposed on a quiet Sunday evening in the clinic garden. They were planting fall flowers, his hands covered in soil when he pulled out a simple ring. This garden started from nothing, he said, just like us, but look how it's grown. Their wedding plans caused quite a stir. Some people still couldn't accept the idea of their union. Anonymous letters arrived, filled with threats and ugly words. But for every hate-filled message, 10 more came offering support and love. Anna's mama threw herself into the wedding preparations with joy, while her daddy quietly asked if he could walk her down the aisle. If you'll have me, he added, his voice rough with emotion. The little girl who'd shown him her drawing that pivotal day asked to be the flower girl. Her crayon picture, now framed, hung in the clinic waiting room as a reminder of how innocence and love could change hearts. One evening, as they sat on the clinic's porch watching the sunset, the doctor shared his own news. The medical board approved our expansion plans, he said, squeezing Anna's hand. We can start offering training programs, teaching other communities how to build bridges like we did. Anna looked out over their town, at the clinic that had become a symbol of healing, at the garden where flowers bloomed without caring about who planted them, at the people walking by who now smiled and waved instead of turning away. You know what's funny? She said softly. Daddy always said he was protecting our way of life. He never realized that sometimes changing your way of life is the only way to save it. The doctor smiled, pulling her close as the last rays of sun painted the sky in shades of hope. Change isn't easy, he said, but love makes it worth it. Their story was far from over, but every day brought new chances to show their community and the world that love could build stronger bridges than hate ever could tear down.